What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some news about Tainted Grail, Fall of Avalon, an open-world RPG set in the grim, dark reimagining of Arthurian legend that I originally took a look at all the way back when it launched into early access in 2023. Now, since then, there's been a fair few updates, but today is perhaps the largest of all those cumulative ones, bringing with it a new zone, an overhaul to many mechanics, so it made sense to dive back into this and check it out, which was made a little bit easier because this update that I'm covering should be going live right as this video does, which is due, of course, to the game's publisher, Awaken Realms, reaching out and asking if I wanted to participate in an event to bring an early look at all these changes and things. And given that I enjoyed my initial run with it, I thought it would be a good time to check it out and discuss all of these various changes. Now, if you're completely unfamiliar with Tainted Grail here, this particular game is in fact based off of a board game of the same name, but the closest thing you could compare this video game to is perhaps simply a darker imagining of Skyrim. But in any event, specifically in regards to this update, we've got more than a fair few things to talk about, as there were tons of overhauls and changes to things like the lighting system, the day-night cycle, and how nighttime especially works, the stats and perk system, basically leveling up, spells, magic, etc. So there's a lot to cover, especially given that we have an entire new zone to talk about. But to kick things off, if you've played this game in its early access form previously, it's important to note that this particular update will be wiping save files. However, in order to compensate for this, they have a preset available for you to pick based off of a bunch of different archetypes. So you can choose to either start from the prologue, the first area called the Horns of the South, or the new area, which I believe is pronounced Kuanacht. I'm not exactly sure, I'm probably butchering that, but you can start there with a level 20 character by selecting one of a few different preset options to show you what your starting abilities are. However, you can of course reset these if you please, but I have to say the UI for this is surprisingly well done, which makes me think that this might be used later on in some form or fashion, because this is a lot of remarkable artwork for something that should technically be a temporary solution, so I wouldn't be surprised to see more of this later. But first, I do want to start from the very beginning in the prologue a little bit, simply because the changes made to the game become very apparent right away. Now, character creation itself is still a work in progress, so there is actually more options than when I played the game a year ago, but it's still fairly limited. So don't expect too in-depth of a cosmetic character customization, but there will be more to come there. Now, once you actually start the prologue, you wake up in prison, being asked a few questions that will potentially let you set up your starting stats, or basically the skills you're good at more specifically, before the guard you're talking to is brutally murdered in front of you, and you are released by the person who did it, who is there specifically to help you escape. Which leads us into the story of Tainted Grail a bit outside of the scope of this video, so I won't go too in-depth on it, but basically if you've never played this game before, the setup for it is that we are a prisoner, and during our escape, we were very specifically led down a path that put us into contact with a otherworldly force called the Weird. Inside this area, we discover a sort of imprisoned soul who decides to tag along with us in order for us both to escape, which grants us access to some unique abilities, such as the ability to temporarily slow down time, and we need to help this sort of lost soul reconstitute itself, and also help out the person who broke us out of prison, who wants us to assassinate King Arthur, who, while technically dead long before this game started, will be resurrected in order to combat the oncoming Red Death, or the Plague, which is sweeping through the land and making it a pretty miserable place. So if you've never played the game before, that's kind of what to expect. But two things really stuck out to me right away in the prologue. For starters, how much better the lighting especially had become, and the changes they made to their skill system, which comes up more towards the end of the prologue when you gain your first level up. So now when you level up, in order to level up at all, you'll have to set down your bonfire, which is like a temporary resting point that you can make that you can either cook, rest, or level up at. You can also, if you have the ability to fuel the bonfire, do a few other things like fast travel from it, identify items you'll be finding, or crafting, specifically alchemy. But from the level up screen, we see a big few changes in terms of how stats work right away. So your character basically has base attributes and skills. Now, when you level up, you'll get a point of each generally, though occasionally you might get more. And your base stats or attributes affect a whole bunch of secondary stats. For instance, strength is of course going to give you better melee damage, affect the stamina cost of those things, endurance makes you harder to kill, dexterity makes you better with things like ranged attacks, spirituality governs magic. But another thing to note here is that later on some equipment actually requires you to have minimums in these stats as well, so that's something to know. But then we have the new skill system. So basically every one of those base stats now has a skill tree associated with it that we'll be able to spend our skill points on, making effectively our build. Now, right away, this has given the game a lot more build diversity, especially when you start combining it with items and all sorts of random effects you might get there, such as necromancer robes that happen to increase your magicka regeneration, making you cast more spells. Overall, these skill trees seem pretty neat, doing things like, say, increasing your attack speed or making you better at parrying in combat, which goes along with some of the combat overhauls they made, or simply making magic more interesting to use, like decreasing the cost of summoning various companions to help you, which goes along pretty well with all the new spells they added. So right away, pretty sweeping changes to simple progression. But another aspect of this update is the combat and magical system overhaul. So the magic system, I would say, the big stuff here is that they simply reworked a few different spells and added some new ones. I don't have a full list of everything that was added, and truth be told, having not played this in about a year, I don't know if some of these spells that I found were added in that interim period, but new things I found that I don't remember messing around with previously were things like the ability to send out a raven that would blind enemies, and it would try specifically to target ranged enemies. There were other spells I could grab that would essentially grant my character thorns for a set period of time, that is to say, returning damage back to the attackers. There were life drain spells that would just pull, of course, health from enemies and bring it back to me, just to name a few of the cool ones. A lot of these spells also got new animations, and combined with the new itemization, with the ability to find unidentified items, etc., there's a lot more ways to play a mage now, but also combat in general, especially the melee stuff, feels much more weighty, with honestly just simple items like shields finally being added that allow you to block and change the flow of combat a bit, which got rid of that, I would say, very floaty feeling that the initial release of the game had. And while it's still certainly not perfect, as it is still in early access after all, it's definitely a big improvement over what there was, especially once you start mastering the parries and the various forms of attacks, like of course light or heavy, or the pushes and managing distance between you and several enemies at a time, for instance. But another new mechanic I wanted to specifically make mention of was the new bonfire system that we kind of already talked about, but one of the things you'll use those bonfires for is of course simply resting. Now, if you haven't fueled this bonfire with a special item that protects you from the weird, come nightfall, you'll have to deal with what is called the Weird Night, where enemies grow stronger and more dangerous, but the rewards increase as well, with you taking them down, of course, giving you just regular old experience, but also the potential to find unidentified items, things to fuel your bonfire with, which you can use to fuel your bonfire to then identify your items. So there's a bit more gameplay involved in the simple act of night falling in the game now, which I thought was a pretty cool touch given the already heavy atmosphere that the game has. But next up, I want to specifically talk a little bit about the new zone. Now, some important things to know about it right away is that it is not as completely polished as the Horns of the South, the area that we've been exploring, so it's a bit more of a work in progress. And to that end, you cannot experience the main story here, but there's still a lot to do simply in terms of exploration, but also various side quests which are in place. A couple of highlights from my own exploration there. I found a guy hiding in a barrel from some generic enemies, but then once you talk to the guy after discovering him, he refuses to leave the barrel and asks you to go deal with a witch who's been hunting him. Another guy I found was kind of T-posing next to a shrine in what I initially thought was a bug, but it turns out it was intentional because he is in fact cursed and is stuck this way until someone will lift the curse or he starves to death, which was kind of a novel idea for a quest. And that's to say nothing of simple exploration-focused discoveries, such as the brand new enemy types you'll of course find here, not least of which was this monstrosity of a sort of frog thing that with careful utilization of some spells I was able to kill, but it was very strong. But otherwise, this new area is dealing very specifically with the Red Death Plague that is going around, which has priests going around trying to say that they can prevent its spread by forcing people out of their homes, as everyone here tries to force the peasants in the area from their farms to Camelot, where they can supposedly protect them, but our arrival and the soul inside of us gives us potential to reignite the Menhir, as it's called, a giant statue that could potentially protect everyone from the weird, if we can get it going again. So there's a lot of tension in the area, which explains the bandits and the witches, but the new enemies, especially in combination with the weird night mechanic, I think adds a lot simply to the exploration that I had fun messing around with in my time. So it'll be cool to discover the secrets of this particular area. But for the time being, I would say that just about covers this update for Tainted Grail: The Fall of Avalon. Overall, I would say the game is moving along very well. I believe they have an intended release date of 2025, so still a ways to go, but the game is shaping up very nicely, and it is certainly making the most of its early access period, as it feels significantly better than when I played it about a year ago. I'm already having a blast with what's on offer here, so I think over the course of now and when the game actually releases and seeing what further refinements and changes they make to the game, as I believe there's even one more full area that has to be made and released at some point, but it has the potential to be something really cool when it's done. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this update and this look at it, as I think they are definitely on the right track with this one. But that is pretty much going to do it for today's video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.